Welcome to Navigating Life with Vision Loss, an Aftersight original podcast. In each episode, we share stories, insights, and practical advice to help you navigate the journey of living with low vision or blindness. Together, we'll embrace each step with courage, grace, and hope.
Hello, this is Kim Wardlow. I am your host for Navigating Life with Vision Loss. We are well into our series on advocacy, and we've covered several topics. Last week's episode was all about technology with the Zach Tidwell, so give that a listen if you weren't able to listen last week. And this week, we are moving on to transportation. So our episode title is Getting There, Advocacy in Motion. And transportation it's a big topic, but it's a huge issue, and it really affects everyone's daily lives, whether you're going to work or just trying to get to a grocery store. We're always trying to get somewhere or get home from somewhere. And especially here in Colorado, we have big areas that are rural, so that they have their own transportation problems. And of course, in the metro area, we do have more public transit, but it can also pose some challenges. So today, our guest is Curtis Chong. So Curtis, I'm so glad you're able to join us. Curtis is blind and has been blind from birth, so he has experience in dealing with transportation as a blind person. He's a longtime advocate for digital accessibility as well as transportation equity. He's the former director of technology at the National Federation of the Blind, and he's a member of the advisory committee for people with disabilities at RTD in Denver. So Curtis, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Kim. Glad to be here.
Well, just to get started, do you want to give folks a little bit of information about yourself and a little bit about your own story?
Absolutely. So I was born in the mid-50s, the 1950s. I had to tell somebody else that was the 20th century, not the 21st. And I grew up in the state of Hawaii. I was a premature baby, so I was part of what they referred to then as the RLF generation, now called prematurity of retinopathy, I think. And so they put me I was 2.5 pounds, and they put me in an incubator, and there was too much oxygen. And so the oxygen damaged my retina to the point where when I was born and growing up as a child, I had some light perception, but that was pretty much all I had from a visual perspective. So, and I grew up in a Chinese family in the state of Hawaii where I was the only blind person. And so culturally speaking, my parents and relatives were very concerned and also made certain negative assumptions, which is pretty normal when everybody else in the family is not blind, about what my prospects for success were going to be. So I will confess that as a child, I was a brat.
That's hard to imagine knowing you now.
Yeah. I was quite rebellious. I was quite outspoken. And what, as I think back on it now, what was interesting to me as I look back was that, blind people are not immune from societal prejudices, right? So I remember when I was going to summer school in the 3rd grade at the School for the Blind, that the teacher got up and read an article about a blind person who was a lawyer, a very active lawyer, blind person. This is, and I got up and I said, how can blind people be lawyers? Right. So you can see, I started with that kind of assumption. And a lot of that came because I inherited the same kind of expectations, because you can't help it. You're not going to start out naturally not having biases that your family has, because you're learning from your older siblings and your relatives. Sure. I had my sister was older than me, my brother was younger than me. And as I say, my family had a lot of trouble figuring out what I could do they learned early on that I could play the piano, and so they wanted me to do music lessons and all this kind of stuff. When I was 5 years old, I have perfect pitch, which
Wow.
is,
That's a gift.
yeah, it is, in a way. If you're going to a concert where the instruments are off key, it's
Then it's not.
not.
That's true. Then it's painful.
Yeah. So they and I together were not sure what I was going to do. And so my parents did some research and they read about blind people who were broadcasters. And of course, in that generation, the most famous blind people were people like George Shearing, Ray Charles, and Stevie Wonder.
Right.
All of them were blind musicians. So voila, let's get our boy into music. Let's do that. Well, I was able to, I was happy looking back on it that I did have the background in learning how to play the piano because when I moved in my 20th year to Minnesota, I moved right in the middle of winter too. So this is the first time I saw snow. I was able to do some part-time work playing keyboard, in a band and stuff like that to make some extra money because back then I was, pretty much broke as a person. And so the even though I grumbled and I hated practicing and all this kind of stuff, kids do this
Sure.
a lot. I'm grateful that I got the ability to do the keyboard and to play music because I still love listening to music. I don't play it anymore because I'm busy doing other things. But that skill was enough to, I could work one night in a band, for example, and make $50. So if I really got lucky and got a steady 2-week gig, I could make quite a lot of money doing that work, and that was fine. But I learned right away as a musician that the work is not steady. The paychecks don't come very often, and you're really lucky if you can get something that'll last more than one night. So I was fortunate to have an aptitude in logic and mathematics, and also to be kind of a brash person who didn't always accept everything people told him. So after I graduated from high school and went to college for a year, I decided to move out of the house. I moved out on Mother's Day. My daughter, who is now grown up and self-supporting, she moved out when she graduated from high school on Father's Day. So everybody keeps telling me what goes around comes
tradition.
around. It's a family tradition. Yeah, right. Exactly. So I was fortunate while living in Hawaii to get a job at the Federal Aviation Administration, officially as a clerk typist, but practically speaking, as a person who the manager was more than happy to train how to program computers. So I learned how to program this really large physical IBM computer that did not talk. And I did everything in Braille. And I used, back then it was Braille for me, audio tapes, and a typewriter. People today don't like to use a typewriter because you don't get any feedback about whether you're typing the right letters or not. But in my generation, the kids at the School for the Blind understood that you had to pay attention to when you were making a mistake as you were typing, because that was the only feedback you were going to get. And I will demonstrate a lot of the old school stuff I used. There were no calculators back then, no adding machines or anything that we could use. So I learned how to do my arithmetic on something called a Taylor slate, which is a very tedious, very slow, awkward process. I'm really disappointed that our teachers at the School for the Blind did not encourage us to use Braille paper and a Braille writer to do math, because later on, as I learned by talking to other blind people, it's easier to break up algebraic equations and do all kinds of other stuff using Braille.
Oh.
So Braille was my go-to technology. I used to walk around decks of cards with Braille on them, and I could play cards with people. It was a way to get myself acquainted with other people who weren't blind. And so when I did programming, everything was on paper, and I had reams of paper full of Braille. And the other skill I learned was to hire readers, which I had to pay for, and nobody was paying for human beings back then, to put things on tape or to sit down with me to read the stuff that was on my desk that I had to read. And so I think I hired a reader for like 10 to 15 hours a week at the time. These days, the profession of human reader is not as popular, I think, as it might have been in my generation. So I got lucky, and that combined with a lot of lucky breaks and meeting other blind people who were far and away ahead of me in terms of their confidence level and their recognition that a lot of the barriers that we have are not necessarily physical or visual, but attitudinal. That helped me a lot to make up my mind. I say to people these days, when I was that age, the concept of work with a capital W was incredibly important for me. I wanted to have a job. I wanted to be able to pay my own bills. I wanted to be in charge of my own money, and I did not want to be dependent on the government to get where I was going. And that desire to do that was really critical when the problems came and when I ran into difficulty as I was, moving from one career to the next or trying to get training and this or that. In the end, the motivation that caused me to want to be working, that I wanted to be employed and a taxpayer, resulted in me spending most of my working life. I'm retired now, but most of my working life, I think the longest break between jobs that I ever had in my life was a month and 1 month.
Oh, wow.
Actually, that I've been working since I was 23 years old, all the way up to the age of 65, with only short breaks in between. Many of the jobs that I moved between, I would quit the day before, like on a Friday, and then I'd show up for the work on Monday at the next job. So there was no gap between. So that's my work history in brief, I guess.
Great. Well, you in telling us about that, you mentioned that you were outspoken and tended to not just accept things you were told. Those kinds of qualities, I can see how they would help in advocacy. What was there a specific instance, or what made you decide to be more involved?
What caused me to do advocacy?
To do advocacy. I mean, I suppose in some ways you might have been almost forced into it as you faced difficulties, but I know you've done so much advocacy work, in tech, education, policy. How did you get involved in it?
Well, when I was between the 8th and 9th grade, as a lot of blind kids did, we went. My parents got me hooked up to go to a summer training program for blind teenagers at the Agency for the Blind in Hawaii, which is called Ho'opono, which means friend. And the thing on the very first day, I remember we weren't using canes at that time. These days, I think it's unthinkable that blind kids don't get canes. But in my generation, we took pride. Can you believe this? In the fact that we didn't use canes, and we thought, the rest of you guys who use canes are like, wow. Something wrong with you. Yeah. But we went to the Agency for the Blind, and on the very first day, we had a class in the afternoon. We would take classes in Braille, classes in interpretive dancing, shop, and travel. They called it O&M, right? Orientation and mobility. So one of the classes we had was called group therapy. You can see where I'm going with this. And the group therapy class, 8 or 9 of us kids were in the class, was led by a psychologist. And he called himself a psychologist. And this bugged me because I thought, I am not crazy. There's nothing wrong with me mentally. I don't like the fact that we have to go to this stupid class called group therapy. And nobody at the purpose of group therapy, as I understood it, was just to talk about our emotional state and all that kind of stuff. It was not focused on what I thought it should be focused on, which was issues related to being blind. So I got kind of mad at that, and I recognized, but I wasn't able to put words on it back then, that the Agency for the Blind in Hawaii at that time really had a very insulting, paternalistic attitude about working with blind people. And I hated it. I didn't like that. And so when I found that there were other blind adults in Hawaii who felt the same way that I did about the paternal nature of the agency and its desire to do whatever, I met with them and tried to figure out ways that we could make the agency better. Now, let me say, this was back in 1969, 1970, right, that long ago. I want to say that today, the Agency for the Blind in Hawaii, I go back, my family's still there. I'm the only idiot in my family who moved to
left?
the mainland permanently. So we go now back in the late 90s, the agency got a new leader who was not blind, by the way, but who really believed in the high expectations that blind people needed to have to get good service. And to the point where today, I'm among a handful of blind people who goes back to that agency to evaluate them to make sure that their transition to what they call the structured discovery approach is still being handled in a positive way with a positive attitude about blindness. So now I'm buddies with the agency. People find this hard to believe, and I help them, when they were first starting to decide how do we implement, Socratic questioning, how do we implement meaningful discussions about blindness and everything. I and others worked with them several times in the early 2000s to guide them along the path to the point where they could become what I think of as a very progressive, forward-looking program for the blind, both in its blindness training program and in its placement. What you do when you work with a VR counselor to go to college and then go get a job afterward. And so now that agency is on the positive side of everything. And so we talk a lot. And I'm now, I suppose you might say, both an advocate and a quote professional, unquote, which that is a scary thought. Because for 15 years, I worked as a vocational rehabilitation, either an administrator or a practitioner in technology, with a bent toward saying, I always found reasons to say yes to people when they were coming for services, but I would tag that with expectations.
Sure.
I would say, well, we're happy to buy this new computer for you, but here's what we want you to do, because we don't want you to get this machine or this equipment or this service and not recognize that your ultimate goal is to go to work. And because I had worked in private and government for 25, 30 years before I went in to work with the blind, I knew what it was like to work where you're the only blind person in an organization of sighted people. When you're in that situation, it's a two-way street. They have to understand how you do things, but you as a blind person, or me as a blind person, I need to understand visual concepts, what matters to them. I need to understand how to interact with them and get on with them as a member of the team. And I felt like I couldn't be the person they looked at who they thought of me as, quote, blind, unquote, first, and then a member of the team second. I wanted it to be the other way around, where I would be thought of as a contributing member of the team who happened to be blind. So after a while, and it takes a little bit of persuasion and education and all that. Most of the people I worked with, they knew that I did things differently, but they also knew that I was a contributing member of the team who could participate in all the discussions. And if I had trouble, I would have the guts to raise my hand and ask a question if something was highly visual that I wasn't getting. And that's a strategy has served me well. And unfortunately, that means that I tend, when I'm working to help other people who aren't in my position, who are blind, I push them pretty hard, because I would say the world isn't made for you. The world does not owe you a living. Employers do not owe you a job. You have to have something that they want to pay for, because they're spending a good deal of money on whatever job it is you're applying for. And if you don't understand that, and if you don't recognize that part of that is dealing with what you might think of as prejudicial attitudes or insulting attitudes about you being blind, and if you don't know how to deal with it in a professional way, and by professional I mean, having the sense to know when the hammer is needed versus persuasion and education. I want to do education and persuasion first, but I'm willing to use the hammer when the education and the persuasion don't work. Because there are going to be times, or there were times in my life, where the hammer had to come out. I remember my friend and I, when we were teenagers, were trying to get a job with a telemarketing firm. They didn't call it telemarketing back then. And it was a company selling light bulbs, and they said they hired people with handicaps. That was the word that was in use back then. So we go in there and we talk to the boss, and he said, no, we can't do anything for you because you're blind. And after all, blind people can't dial the telephone. We used dials on telephones back then.
Really?
And we were incensed about that. And so my friend and I got together and we wrote a letter to the editor, and it got published. And we said, here's a company that hires the handicapped, so-called, but they won't hire blind people because they believe that blind people don't know how to dial a phone. And yet, as kids, I remember the days when we had only one phone in the house, and we were limited to 5 minutes a call.
Too.
Right? Yeah. And I broke that rule all the time. Why? Because blind kids, we talk to each other all the time on the phone. It's not good enough we see each other all day. No, we have to get on the phone. So we were insulted, and we did something about it. We wrote a letter to the editor, and it got published. So those kinds of things were my initiation to learn how to be an advocate. And I also had some of that tempered by adults who were smarter than me, who said things like, when you're dealing with the government, you make sure you have everything in writing. When you're dealing with the government, you focus on issues, not personality. When you're dealing with the government, you document, because when you are asking for something, you better have all the information that you need to, number one, prove that they did something wrong, and number two, to justify why it is that you're asking for the thing that you want them to spend money on. So that stuck with me throughout my entire life. And, there's a right way and a wrong way, in my opinion, to advocate. And the hard part is knowing, like I said, when to use the club or when to use the soft approach. I will tell you, the soft approach most often works. But when you have to use the club, then you better get about using it and mean it. Otherwise, you're not going to win. So, for example, in Minnesota, when I lived in Minnesota, I lived there for 23 years. When my daughter was 12, this would be like early 90s, I went with her and a bunch of other kids to a very large amusement park called Valley Fair. This is my first visit to Valley Fair. And you pay $20 each person, and you get the whole day. You can ride whatever you want. You still got to pay for food, right? All that stuff. So we go there, and the first thing that happens is the ticket agent at the gate, when you're going in, goes to my daughter and whispers to her, can you take him over to guest relations so that we can explain to him the rules about riding at the park? And my daughter's like, what the heck? So she goes, Dad, I don't know what they're doing. And so we go to guest relations, we grab the brochure, and we find out that people with disabilities are not permitted to ride the rides.
Oh my gosh.
Alone. You have to sit with somebody who can see. Right? Or what they called it, a responsible adult, being defined as anybody 48 inches tall or taller. That's the definition of responsible adult. So I and other blind people, we got together, and in Minnesota, there was a human rights law that said you can't discriminate on the basis of disability. We filed a complaint. The complaint was accepted, and it took us 5 years of back and forth to get the park to change the policy that required blind people and other people with disabilities to go to abide by certain rules about like what rides could you ride. So for example, if I was riding the roller coaster, I could not sit in, it was 2 by 2 by 2. You couldn't sit in a car by yourself or with another blind person. If you were riding the corkscrew, you couldn't sit next to a blind person if you were blind, because somebody had to tell you what was coming up. Or that was their rule. So, we went as far as we had 9 blind people go to the park. We were denied the ability to sit next to each other on one of the rides, and we held up the ride for 40 minutes until the management caved and said, all right, you guys can ride, blah, blah, blah. And the manager gave me this real technical explanation about what the ride would do, even though I had ridden that ride, 5-10 times before. But we won. We got them to change the rules. It took 5 years, but we got it done. And I call that a little bit of hitting with a hammer, but a lot of the regular legal process that is supposed to work, and making sure that we were reasonable. For example, we kept saying, we don't want money. We're not here to sue you guys for money. We want you to change the rules. I don't care. Yeah, we want access. Right? So that's what we did.
And that's a great example And it kind of helps us segue as you're talking about getting access to rides and amusement parks. But I'm sure in your life, as you've been, especially in your working life, getting to and from work, you've had a lot of experience in other types of rides and transportation.
Yes. Yeah.
When did you kind of get more involved in advocacy for transportation?
Because I know the topic is.
I know
right.
we get off because things are interesting.
No,
it's so interesting to talk to you, but I know you've done some advocacy work specifically in transportation, and I'm sure that has changed over the years as our modes of transportation. Like we didn't have Ubers and Lyfts back in the 90s and those kinds of things. So, so the advocacy would have changed as well.
Yeah, so let's start by saying back in the day, the primary form of transportation that was available to everybody who didn't drive was buses and taxi cabs, right? Those were the two things. This is long before we had paratransit and all of that kind of stuff. So in my lifetime, I can recall my first job in Minnesota as a programmer trainee was all the way in downtown St. Paul, and I lived in North Minneapolis. So the bus ride, when we bought our house or when we decided where apartments we were going to live, I will tell you that a major factor in our decision making about where to move was how close are you to a bus route? How frequent do the buses go by? Because if we didn't live close to a bus route, we decided that we weren't going to move to a particular area because that was going to be very disadvantageous to us. My wife and I both don't drive.
Right.
Okay. So because we couldn't afford at that time taxi fare for most things, we would use taxis for things where the buses didn't run frequently enough or when it was late at night or something like that. But primarily we rode the bus. And so the prevailing wisdom was that if you were a blind person and you wanted to go anywhere, you better learn how to ride the bus. That was all you could do, period. So an hour and a half each way, that's 3 hours of your day eaten up with going back and forth. That was what we started with. I very rarely had a job where I could walk to work. And that evolved to the point where after the ADA got passed and paratransit was beginning to become a reality, we were looking at that as, in the NFB of Minnesota, for example, about how valuable was paratransit going to be for blind people. And we had this huge fight with paratransit because, believe it or not, we thought in the NFB of Minnesota back then, this is way a long time ago, so people don't kill me about this, but we said people whose only disability is blindness should not automatically be eligible to receive paratransit services. And they can get training, they can get, good travel training, and they can, maybe you give them a grace period of 2 years or something, and you say, okay, so if you don't have training, you get the training and we'll enable you to ride paratransit. Right. But our position was, we thought blind people should, as, just blind, and because of blindness, should not ride on the paratransit system. Well, we lost that battle, I will say. And in a lot of ways, these days, I don't think you can find anybody, it's hard to find anybody who's just blind, whose only disability is blindness, right? Usually now it's combined with a bunch of other things. And so I'm happy to say that our official position and mine is that you don't just say blindness prevents you from using paratransit. What does prevent you from using paratransit, if I might say so, is the fact that maybe the service you get is so bad that you don't want to use it. And I'm talking about the traditional access a ride type service where the vehicle comes, gets you, and you pay $450 or $225 if you're low income.
Frequently called access-a-late. No. I've heard it termed.
Yes, access-a-late. Exactly. Right. Or there's other derogatory terms. So the thing about access-a-ride, which was interesting, was number one, it's more expensive than the bus. And it is just as bad in terms of the ability to get somewhere or to be picked up on time, right? Maybe worse. So The traditional paratransit as we now know it in Denver today, I think is not a desirable service for anybody who can find other ways to get around. Why is that? Because the performance is so inadequate. Now, some people who, for whatever reason, need door-to-door service, and I literally mean, the driver gets up and comes to your door, takes you to the vehicle. And there are people like that. If you need that, Access-a-Ride right now is the only alternative you have. And what happens is that alternative costs you money to the tune of $4.50, unless you can qualify, when was it? 2023, I think it was, when they first allowed people with low income to get a half fare of $2.25 on Access-a-Ride. And that was a long time in coming, because I've lived here since 2018, and throughout that whole time until 2020, I think it's 2023, 24, until that time, all the Access-a-Ride passengers are paying $4.50 a trip, and so that's $9 round trip, which is not an inconsiderable amount of money. It's pretty. It can be quite bad, costly for people who are on low incomes. Okay, so when in a couple of years ago, RTD decided that they wanted to do something different, right? I think what they didn't pay attention to was how unpopular the traditional paratransit service was, which prevented the unpopularity. It caused a lot of people simply not to sign up for that service. No, anybody who was not in a wheelchair, who could choose other alternatives, would voluntarily choose not to bother with Access-a-Ride, partly because of cost and partly because of performance, So when they opened up this pilot project that said, okay, now if you're in the Access-a-Ride program, we will enable you now to get subsidized trips using taxi services like Metro Cab, Metro Taxi, Z-Trip, Uber, and then later on Lyft was added. And we will pay, the numbers vary, but currently it's like $25 a ride for 60 rides per month. You have to pay the tip, you have to pay anything over $25, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When they did that, they were absolutely shocked when a tremendous number of people signed up for that particular service, the service called Access on Demand, and they couldn't figure out why they were doing that. And the rest of us are like, duh, you don't realize that there's this pent-up demand for that kind of service, because nobody who can choose not to do it will want to sign up for Access-a-Ride. And so what happened was the cost went from $65,000 a month during the pilot all the way up to $1.1 million
right.
a
It's
month.
become a huge budgetary issue now for RTD.
It has, if you look at the change, but when you think of RTD's overall budget of what, over $1 billion, right, a year, $12 million a year isn't that much when you think about it, right? So I'm just looking at the pure numbers. Now, what some, there's a mix of opinion within the blind community about the following. Some people say, man, if I just had a car, these are like if you're a blind couple or you live by yourself as a blind person and you've never bought a car, I think sometimes we don't realize how much it costs to own a vehicle that we have to pay for ourselves. That's one factor. The other, because I ask people who can, like my daughter, how much do you pay for your car? Well, she's making enough money that she was able to pay for her car in cash. Not too many people do that. They go on loans. And so the average number I'm hearing from people is $600 or $700 a month.
Plus insurance and gas and all the things that go along with that, maintenance.
Correct. Yeah. Now, if you're a blind couple, you understand this, right? I mean, the other half, you're somebody's paying for the car, so there's money there. But if a blind person, one, and the other person is sighted who owns the car, Although I did have a blind friend in California who actually was a blind student in college, and he bought a car, owned a car, and then he would sort of inveigle his roommates or whatever to do some driving for him in exchange for a use of the car. Now, that probably cost him a lot of money insurance-wise, but I thought that was a clever idea. I was going to say, but
that's innovative, yeah.
You know, so where we are right now is RTD is very worried publicly about how to make the program sustainable, this Access on Demand program that is now spending a $1 million plus per month. And what has happened on our side is that a growing number of people who want something better to get to and from work efficiently, or who never had a job, but now all of a sudden they can get a job because they figure their transportation is going to be covered, they now have become quite dependent on the service. Is that wrong? Not necessarily, but you know, if you get 60 rides a month and you're using most of those rides to go to and from work, you're going to use up most of those rides in just getting to and from work, transportation wise. Okay. Now, the one thing that nobody talks about with respect to all of this is the necessity for the Uber and Lyft portion of the service to use a smartphone and to be proficient with your smartphone, your iPhone, your Android phone, whatever, because you have to use the Uber or Lyft app or both to order a ride, to monitor the ride, and to pay for the ride, right? If you're a blind / otherwise disabled person who is not able for whatever reason, or is not confident for whatever reason in using the smartphone, you're not going to take advantage. You can't take advantage of the service, right? So what you'll do is you're stuck then with Access-a-Ride or with going back to the traditional bus / light rail, which everybody admits has fallen off. You know, the quality of that service has really gotten bad because of the pandemic. Ridership is low. Timely performance is low. There's a lot of maintenance headaches. I mean, I get tons of alerts every day about this ride canceled due to no operator, this ride canceled due to mechanical failure, this ride canceled due to police action, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as I look at wanting to go somewhere, I do a cost-benefit analysis of versus time.
Yes.
If time is critical because I'm pressed and I have to get somewhere in a hurry, I may have to spend money. I'm not signed up for Paratransit. I just want to say, I may have to request an Uber or Lyft ride now because I want to get somewhere and I don't have time. But what about those people who can't do it because they just can't get the smartphone to work? What is the alternative mechanism? I know we've been advocating with RTD some to set up a call-in function that would enable people who had no other alternative to use Uber and Lyft. And given their financial pressures, they never did manage to get around to figure out an effective way to address that particular issue. But it is one that is in front of my mind all the time, because I am frankly quite tired of the tendency that's happening in our world today, where all the cool things that we're going to be able to do are based on our ability to use a smartphone and an app on that smartphone to invoke, to activate the service or to take advantage of the service. This is our reality. And so those people who, for whatever reason, are not able to benefit from the use of a smartphone, iPhone, Android phone, those are the only two I can think of, they're in a world of hurt. And nobody has done research to tell us what percentage of our population is in that category. All I hear are anecdotal stories about, well, I go to the convention of the blind and everybody in the room has an iPhone. Is that really true? Well, first of all, if you're at a convention of the blind, you've already got the fortitude and the stamina and the motivation to go there. Yeah, it may
be the people who weren't able to come to the convention, maybe the folks that you're trying to measure.
And we don't hear from them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like the silent majority, right? They used to say, what is the silent majority? Right? The silent majority or the invisible majority are the people who don't show up, who don't make noise, who are essentially trapped in their situation because the technology is beyond them. And when I say beyond them, I'm trying not to be insulting, because there are lots of people who, you know, if you're a blind person like me who has grown up completely blind most of your life. What you value a lot, or at least what I value a lot, are real buttons and switches that I can feel. And when I look at the screen of today's smartphones, it feels to me like a desert. It's
a touch
completely
screen.
blank screen. Right. Now, I got over it, right? I learned how to use the iPhone. I took 2 years to decide that I was actually going to get one. I was very resistant about it, but I'm now the one that people come to and say, oh, how do I do this on my iPhone? How do I use the Uber or Lyft app? Or how do I get Siri to do something? Which I regret to say Siri is a horrible example of AI, right? It's not really that great. And so whenever, like the Uber, Lyft, the Metro Taxi, the Z-Trip thing, so suppose the only way I can get a ride is to make a phone call. Now, what's interesting is RTD through Access on Demand, right? They give you these vouchers that you can use for Uber and Lyft. And a couple of years ago, Uber made this big announcement that you could call 1-800, there was an 800 number that you as a potential Uber passenger could call. And if you give me your credit card number and your phone number, you could get a ride on Uber. But what I found out was it's very frustrating. They don't tie that service back to your Uber individual profile, which may have a voucher in it that allows you to get RTD to pay for part of your ride. So one doesn't touch the other. So once again, those people who are not comfortable with their smartphones or don't have one are being left out of this equation and not getting anything. And there's no decent alternative available other than there's GoGo Grandparent, where seniors can call a service and get charged a horrendous amount of money extra in order to get an Uber or a Lyft ride. It's a beautiful service, but it's expensive. You got to have money to take advantage of that.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to Navigating Life with Vision Loss. My name is Jonathan Price, the podcast producer here at AfterSight, and we're doing something a little unique this week. We're actually publishing 2 episodes. So if you're listening to this on Tuesday, we have another episode that's going to be coming out on Thursday. And you're not going to want to miss this because Curtis Chong is going to talk more about rural transportation, local transportation, and some very good tips and tricks that you're going to need to get around in the best and safest way possible. So come back next week, take a listen, and we hope this show has helped you navigate your life with vision loss.